Good morning. Welcome back to a new week and another edition of our Anchored in the Word morning reflection. This week we are in Psalm 36. And so if you have a Bible, I'd like to encourage you to pick it up and let's read it together. I'm not going to read the entire section. What I'm going to do is I'll read the first half of the Psalm. Then, Lord willing, tomorrow I'll read the second half of the Psalm. And then we will kind of go back and forth throughout the week so that we can really get a sense of the Psalm without just reading through the whole thing. I think that the things that we're going to talk about this week are going to be incredibly encouraging and helpful for our perspective. I know when I preached through this passage of Scripture 2 Sundays ago, the text was tremendously encouraging to people. I got a lot of feedback from that. And so I would encourage you to share these studies with people this week because I think a lot of people will find it to be helpful. Psalm 36, and we'll begin reading in verse number 1. The transgression of the wicked saith within my heart, that there is no fear of God before their eyes. For he flattereth himself in his own eyes, until his iniquity be found to be hateful. The words of his mouth are iniquity and deceit. He hath left off to be wise, and to do good. He deviseth mischief upon his bed. He setteth himself in a way that is not good. He abhorreth not evil. Thy mercy, O Lord, is in the heavens, and thy faithfulness reacheth unto the clouds. Thy righteousness is like the great mountains. Thy judgments are a great deep, O Lord. Thou preservest man and beast. Now, the first thing we're going to focus on this week will be the section dealing with verses 1 to 4. But before we look at those verses, how David is reflecting on the time that he's living in, I think we need to stop and just state this because it's very obvious. We do live in tumultuous times. Now, if you enjoy studying history, which is something that I enjoy doing, I like reading history, I like listening to commentary on history, I like watching documentaries, always have enjoyed those things. You do recognize, as you study history, that every period in history has had its difficulties. It's had tremendous difficult times. Wars and sicknesses and conflicts and tensions within government, injustices in the political systems of the day. That's a part of life in a fallen world. And as we look at the times that we live in and we look at the times that went before us and we ask the question, what lies beyond us, assuming the Lord Jesus doesn't come in our lifetime or even in the lifetime of our children, there are really two possible ways that we could respond to this. The first is what we would say is the natural response, the way that people, just by virtue of human nature and the times that we live in, how we tend to respond. One of those responses would be anger. We see things and it infuriates us because of what's going on. I'm sure if you watch the news and you listen to political commentary, there are times that the most common response is just anger. The other response is fear. People look at what's going on, they hear about what's going on, and they become very defensively minded. They're frustrated. They become anxious. They want to rebel against the system that is going on. Those are all natural responses. Whether you're a Christian, not a Christian, this is where human nature tends to go. But there's another potential response, and this is a response that goes beyond natural. It is supernatural. This is the response that the Bible calls us to. A response of confidence, living with a stability, being strengthened and being resolved to respond correctly in circumstances, being content with what God has given us, keeping our focus, having internal peace. Now we look at those two different potential ways that someone could respond to circumstance, and they are very different. There's a tremendous difference between those two ways. And the question we should ask is, how should we as Christians be living? And the answer is not the first response, it's the second series of responses. Confidence, resolve, being strengthened, content, having an internal peace, staying focused. That's how we as Christians should be responding. The next question we should ask is, was that even possible for us to live in this kind of a way, considering how tumultuous the days are that we're living in? Well, the answer is, of course it is. If God would tell us to live this way, if God has provided everything that we need in order to live this way, then we need to do it. And so then the last question will be, well, how? Well, these verses are going to point us in the direction of how we're supposed to process the circumstances that we're living in and how we're supposed to respond to them. And so as we begin our study this week, I want us to notice the way that David reflects on the time that he lived in. The way he puts it in verses 1 to 4 is he talks about how vicious and how evil the world is around him, the people that he is observing. And let's remind ourselves that David's a king. So as a king, David is looking at civil disputes. He's looking at legal disputes. He understands what's going on within his own family. He is governing a group of people. And so his responsibility is to protect them, and they had vicious enemies. And the way that people fought in the ancient world was quite horrific. If we were exposed to the level of carnage that most people would have lived through in their lives in the ancient world, I think we would all end up having PTSD, okay? I mean, they saw horrific things, brutal things. What did David say about the time that he was living in? Well, in verse 1, he says, these people have no fear of God before their eyes. He says when they go to make decisions, they don't care about God. They don't think about God. He's not on their mind. He doesn't factor into the choices that they make. In verse 2, he says that these are a people who flatter themselves, and their iniquity is hateful. That's the way he describes it. People justify their evil actions by comparing themselves to other people, and they say, I'm not as bad as they are. He talks in verse 3 about how the words of their mouth are full of iniquity and full of deceit, and they are not wise, and they do not do what is good. These are people whose lives are characterized by dishonesty. They're unwise. They don't do the right thing. In verse 4, he says that they devise mischief on their beds. The idea is that they're continually thinking about evil. They're continually plotting to do things that are evil. When something consumes a person, that's what they think about first thing in the morning when they wake up. Last thing they think about as they're going to bed. It's something that they dream about. I gave this illustration when I preached the sermon on the Sunday that I dealt with this passage. And I remember my first wrestling match. Wrestling's an interesting sport because it's one-on-one, it's combative, and you can't blame anybody but yourself for how the match goes down. And I remember going out there and I'm competing with this guy, and the very first thing I'm experiencing is looking up at the lights with my head and arms squeezed together, and this guy's trying to pin me. I'm doing everything I can to fight off my back. And that's what the entire match was like. When I went to bed, all I could think about was what I did wrong and what I could have done differently and all of those things. It consumed me. Well, there are some people that they're consumed with evil. That's all they can think about. That's all they are consumed with because they want to do evil. They want to do others in. They want to take from others. They want to abuse authority. They want to get advantage. Life is a chess match to get what they want. David laments this. Also in verse 4, he says that these are people who set themselves in ways that are not good, and they do not abhor evil. Now, what David is describing in his day, thousands of years ago, I think every single one of us could describe in the time that we live in. Turn on the television, get online and watch videos, listen to podcasts, observe people that we potentially work with, maybe people that are in our community, most certainly a lot of people in political power, dictators around the world, and guess what? Human nature hasn't changed. It's the same problem that was going on thousands of years ago. And the question we should ask is, well, how does God deal with this? Does God just protect his people so that they don't have to experience these challenges? And the answer is, well, God protects us, but he doesn't remove us. Think about what it says in John 17 when Jesus is praying in his high priestly prayer. This is the way he prays about his people. He says, I have given them thy word, and the world hath hated them, because they're not of this world, even as I am not of this world. I pray not that thou shouldest take them out of the world, but that thou shouldest keep them from the evil. As thou hast sent me into the world, even so have I also sent them into the world. You know what that tells us about God's way of dealing with the believer and the world? God protects his people in the world, but he doesn't insulate them from all evil. He doesn't remove them from the world. He leaves them there. He plants them there because they are to function as salt and as light. And God preserves us in the midst of difficulties. So what that tells us is that we've got to learn how to live in a broken world, because it's God's will that we learn to live in a healthy way in this world. And so the question that I want to answer tomorrow is, well, how do we do this? How do we do this? We've established that this is the kind of world we live in. We've established that God expects us to function in this world, and he expects us to function in a healthy way in this world. The question is how? Well, Lord willing, tomorrow we'll deal with that. So this morning, I hope that as you think about this, it will provide some clarity for your experience in this fallen world. And it'll give you hope, because there is hope. God would not expect us to do something that he wouldn't empower us to do. So let's think about that as we go about our day, and Lord willing, we'll deal with the next text tomorrow. Bye now.